Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. In fact, today we're going to do something a little bit different. This is going to be a live stream, taking a look at some of the major announcements Grinding Gear Games have made in the last sort of 20-30 minutes time. They've come up with a whole bunch of information about the upcoming Legacy of Frisia event. So they've decided to give it a name, and that is going to be named after one of the past emperors. Not Emperor Azaro, who is a bit better known to most Path of Exile 2 players and Path of Exile 1, sorry. But it is also one of the figures of Path of Exile 1's lore. Anyways, welcome to people that are dribbling in. If you're watching this after the fact, then there's a couple of things you can do. Part of the reason I'm doing this on YouTube rather than Twitch is that you can speed it up if you want. And you can also, I can potentially cut out parts where I'm just talking about talking about things people say in chat afterwards. I will try to repeat any questions that are asked in chat that I do decide to answer. I'm not necessarily going to be able to get to everyone's because it's going to get busy. And additionally, some people are going to ask questions that have already been answered. Now, if you are someone who watched late or joined the stream late, sorry, you can rewind and then put it to a higher speed until that point. That's something if people mention in chat that they're behind, just tell them that they can do that and that will help save a bunch of time there. Anyways, the core thing that's being done with the Legacy of Frisia event, the most significant thing that we know so far is they're going to be changing the 19 Ascendancies. A bunch of these are going to be scrapped ideas, things that were sort of tested a little bit, but that never ended up getting formalized into a full Ascendancy. It is my expectation from what I see here, these are going to be a bit lower power than the base game. And I think that kind of works with the sort of people that will be playing a limited time event. The most hardcore players generally will find that new builds to explore will work well for them. And additionally, they're the players for whom the higher difficulty will probably work, because obviously lower character power just means higher difficulty. At the same time, for the people who are a bit more casual in Path of Exile 1, I think this event, just by virtue of being a month long, they might find that it's too condensed. The timeline might be too small to complete all their Atlas and get solidly farming at endgame. Of course, there'll be some people it doesn't work for, but I do think that there's a pretty deliberate decision that's been made to make these a little bit weaker. Now, this is also going to be one of those cases where the game is going to feel really different, and there'll be some builds that are only going to work in this. It would not surprise me if they end up deciding to void this league, and that's because your character might end up just in a brick state when it finishes, because you've been trying to build, a Harbinger as a witch, and then you go back into standard and there's no Harbinger. Alternately, maybe Grinding Gear Games decide that all of these Ascendancies can just be dumped into the main game, and maybe they'll just end up being a bit weaker, but people can play around with them. That is stuff we will find out. People are saying in chat they're not sure whether to stick with this or jump over to PoE 2. Ultimately, I think play whichever's going to be more fun for you. If you like the idea of weird and wonderful builds in Path of Exile 1, then play this event. If you're preferring PoE 2 at the moment, play PoE 2 instead. And if you're still making up your mind, then maybe have a listen and discuss here, and then work out which one's going to be more for you. Anyway, what they have spoiled today, the Harbinger is one of the new Witch Ascendancies. Now, all of these have their details in the Harbinger garbled script, which is kind of cool. There's a number of weird looking skills here. These are not brand new. These are provided by some of the items that are tied to the Harbinger's Harbinger map, the Uber Beachhead. The Infused Beachhead drops as a very rare drop, or maybe it's just an uncommon drop from the end of the Tier 15 Beachhead. And then when you run it, you get a scroll that can upgrade one of the base Harbinger items into an Uber version of itself. For example, the Torrent's Reclamation is one of these, and this is where you get the Greater Harbinger of Time skill. Greater Harbinger of Time is actually pretty weak nowadays. It used to be miles better than it is now, but what it does is it summons a Harbinger that follows you around and gives you a buff. And what it does is for 10 seconds, every 10 seconds, you get this buff for 8 seconds. And so it's basically 80% uptime. It is 10% increased action speed. So you can think of that as being 80% uptime on something that's very similar to Tailwind, but it would stack with Tailwind as well, I believe. Now, this version does not affect enemies. Apparently the regular version of Harbinger of Time does. And this one then provides... it also provides the same boost to the enemies as well. And it has a 20-second cooldown. So there's quite a difference between Greater Harbinger of Time and Normal Harbinger of Time. All that said, Torrent's Reclamation is a reasonably good belt, but it's one that fell off hard. It got nerfed a while ago. It's not easy to get this item, but it's a bit easier to get than Mage Blood or Headhunter. But it's, generally speaking, harder than the tier 1 unique. So it's harder than Rizlatha's Coil, but easier to get than your likes of Mage Blood. But that's basically the origins of this item. It used to be better than it is now. There's a divination card for this, but it drops only in Poorjoy's Asylum, I believe, and that thing is just not that common. It's not that common to get access to that map, and then the card is very rare as well. So that said, sort of gives you a bit of an idea as to what Torrent's Reclamation's Greater Harbinger of Time does. Now, there's a few of these effects. There's Greater Harbinger of Focus, and there is Greater Harbinger of the Arcane. Let's have a quick look at the Immortal Will, which is the one that grants you the Greater Harbinger of Focus. So this summons an Immortal Harbinger minion. The minion will occasionally apply the Immortal Will on the player character while the player is channeling. So this is channeling related. It's a buff that lasts for 4 seconds with a cooldown of 8 seconds, so it has roughly 50% uptime when you get it from the shield while you're channeling. And while you are channeling, you are immune to status ailments, you gain immunity to stun, 20% damage reduction, and immunity to curses. So this is a pretty strong effect. Of course, the drawback is that if you're using the Immortal Will itself, it's somewhat limiting. You're forced to use this shield that's, it's not terrible, but it's not good either. You can get much better than this. So that is what you're going to get if you decide to go down the path that gives you the Greater Harbinger of Focus. Now, there's something leading up to that, and that is buffs on you expire 30% slower, debuffs 30% faster. Debuffs expiring 30% faster is reasonable. Buffs on you expire 30% slower is actually pretty strong. There's a number of good buffs, but I wouldn't say that this is feeling like a powerhouse 4 points. It feels like a serviceable 4 points once you factor in all of the buffs that you're getting there. I am working under the assumption that you still have the same cooldowns on the Greater Harbinger of Focus. So this is not going to be permanent resistance to all ailments and stuns and all that sort of stuff. So that's my first thoughts there, is that this is kind of cool, but I don't feel like it's very strong for 4 Ascendancy points. Surging Thoughts was next. This has Greater Harbinger of the Arcane. Now, Greater Harbinger of the Arcane is one that I need to look up. This is the one that conjures a whole bunch of various shock and the like effects. It's quite tricky, this one. So, summons an Immortal Harbinger minion. The minion has 2 buff spells it will cast on you. Arcane Surge, and a buff that grants Chance to Shock and Lightning Penetration. I'm just looking if there's any evidence on the numbers here. It's not really clear what those numbers are from the PathOfExile 1 wiki page, unless there's more information on that. It doesn't look like it. And that's one to test. But in any case, it's just getting Arcane Surge is nice, Shock is nice, but none of this is phenomenal here. And yeah, what Silverwing is saying in chat there is that, yeah, you do get stun immunity as well from the Immortal Will while the Harbinger of Focus is on you, but you're not permanently going to have that on you. So you might want to have some other solution to stun, and that ends up not running at cross purposes. The fact that the Greater Harbinger of Focus just doesn't have 100% uptime, and I don't think that this Ascendancy gives you enough to get 100% uptime on it. Maybe with buffs on you expire 30% slower, so 4 seconds divided by 0.7, you're looking at roughly 6 seconds there. You don't need that much cooldown reduction if the cooldown reduction on your character applies to the Greater Harbinger of Focus. If it doesn't, then you're going to need to get more debuffs on you expire slower. You're going to need to get that debuffs on you expire slower up to the level of 100%. And even then, it's only while you're channeling that it's going to be cast on you. So yeah, essentially, if you channel a skill at 9 seconds, or let's just say at timer 0, you start channeling, the Harbinger immediately casts the Immortal Will skill on you. That lasts for 4 seconds. Maybe you extend that to 9 seconds. But at 8 seconds, it's going to fall off you, and then it's not going to come back until you start channeling again after 8 seconds. If you've got a metronome sitting next to you and you're very good at timing that and always starting a rechannel, I guess you could do it. I could see this working with a Winterorb character perhaps, but I'm not 100% set on this setup. I feel like there's power there, but there's so much more power in other options. However, 40% increased CDR on this small node here, leading to Greater Harbinger of Time, and then Greater Harbinger of Time being arguably the strongest of these, the one from Torrent's Reclamation Belt, that is looking a bit better. This feels like 4 points I'm happy with here. I think you're getting quite a lot of power out of that. You also have the option of having Temporal Chains on you as a 0 reservation aura, so you would have to tie that to Blasphemy support, but that actually does quite a bit for you. Hey Max, thank you for the super chat there. May your Valorbs have interesting results. There is also more support though for channeling here. You've got immune to curses, unaffected by chill, unaffected by shock while channeling. All of this is good stuff, but I wouldn't say it's fantastic. And also a lot of it just reinforces some of the things you're getting from Greater Harbinger of Focus. Ultimately, the way that I see it, other than the stun immunity, Greater Harbinger of Focus plus this node is still inferior to having Purity of Elements on plus one other source of something else that provides you with stun immunity. Stun immunity is not trivial to get, but it's also not something that's like that you can't get either. So all in all, not particularly sold on the power of anything down in the focus section, but the Greater Harbinger of Time is all right. 40% CDR is very good on certain builds. What was the build that always used... What was the build that was buying all the Shaper influenced Stygian Vices a couple of leagues ago? There was something. There was... Obviously, there was Cast on Critical Strike, Inquisitor, which is dead. That build is dead. The one that used Cast on Critical Strike with Lancing Steel to trigger Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction. Dead of Chain Reaction, and also Desecrate. So that was the idea of it. That build took massive nerfs, and even with the 40% CDR, that wouldn't be enough to get it going again. Or maybe it would be enough to make it work, but it wouldn't be enough to be strong. There's, Ball Lightning of Orbiting Castle Channeling Mjolnir Archmages come up in chat. That's an excellent thought, actually. Honestly, I feel like I've been thinking of channeling and not thinking of Cyclone there. So perhaps there is something there. A whole bunch of interesting stuff that's going on. But as I say, I think the good stuff is the CDR and the Greater Harbinger of Time. On the left-hand side, we have the Temporal Chains, like we mentioned. Then we have the Greater Harbinger of the Arcane, which is the one that provides all of the shock shenanigans. And yeah, like I feel like this is... probably not there. This is PathOfExile 1, not PathOfExile 2. Proliferation of shocks, proliferation of chills and stuff like that is just much easier in PoE 1 than it is in 2. You can get a glove implicit that it's wrong to say the glove implicit matches the effect of this, but it sort of almost does. You could use Beric's Respite, and then you've also got the ability to get a whole bunch of other shenanigans going. So that one I'm not sold on. And Mana Recovery and ES Recovery feels like a notable on the main passive tree. Maybe it's a bit too good to be a notable on the main passive, but it feels like a cluster on the main passive tree, whereas most Ascendancy nodes feel like they're more than that. So if I was to play a Harbinger, I would be taking this node. Temp Chains has no reservation if cast as an aura. I would be taking Greater Harbinger of Time and CDR. And then the last 2 points, I feel like it's either just ES Recovery, Mana Recovery, or buffs and debuffs, depending which works better for you. That's going to be a very weak fourth Labyrinth, but you do have a very strong... well, you got to guess... This is going to do very little early in the game. I feel like you could do a bunch of different things. You could go 1, 2, 3, 4, or you could go 1, 2, 3. Both would work. One would not do anything until you get Blasphemy, which, if I recall correctly, Blasphemy is in Act 4. But that said, there's no need to do Lab 1 until Act 4 anyway. So I feel like this is like lower power than the base game, like we were saying at the start, but not massively lower. One thing that's interesting that's come up in chat is that people are disagreeing on the merits of the Settlers League. I think the thing with Settlers has been that the last 2 leagues, Affliction and then Necropolis, have been ultra high loot leagues for top-end players. Settlers took a different route where there's a whole bunch of loot that you get out of the Settlers mechanic, but there's a limit you can't scale past. Once you have enough gold income that you can keep your level 10 farmers going all the time, Settlers hits a point where playing more doesn't scale the loot up anymore. I think that maybe the top sort of 5% of players feel like it's stingy compared to Necropolis and particularly Affliction, whereas at the same time, people who are not top 5% players but are solidly at endgame are finding Settlers as giving them the occasional Mirror Shard, like a realistic chance of getting a Mirror Shard that you might get to fire off, depending on whether you're doing the prohibited library strategy that I reported on a while ago of sending 17 million dual crop. Then it seems like you get about 0.65 Mirror Shards per attempt at that. And if you're sustaining level 8 farmers, you can do that twice a week. And if you're doing it on level 10 farmers, you can do it 3 times a week. Or alternately, you can go for the 50 million shipments, which take about 3 times as long to send off. So about 9 days or about 6 days, depending upon how advanced your farms are. But once you get faster, once you get to the point that you can build up 50 million every 9 days, or every 6 days, sorry, 6.5 or 7, I think it is, there is no further scaling of the loot from the Settlers mechanic. And I think there's this situation where some people like that because they feel like they're not getting as crushed by the people at the very top end of the league economy as they would have, say, in Affliction. Whereas other people are like, hey, in Affliction, I was farming, a mirror every second week. And that's the sort of difference of opinion that I think we're seeing coming out in the chat there. Although, of course, there's always going to be people that aren't thinking of the loot either. They're just thinking of their own enjoyment of a particular mechanic. I have liked Settlers. I feel like it's overdone its welcome at the moment. And hey, Justin, thank you for the super chat there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results. Now, that is what we know so far about the Harbinger Ascendancy. Next up, we have the Gambler Ascendancy for the Duelist, which is kind of intriguing. This is going to be very polarizing. Most people are going to look at this and say, this is terrible. This is all sorts of unreliable effects. But there is quite a bit of power here, and that's the thing that's so interesting. This is definitely not working for everyone, but it's going to be a bunch of fun. Like, for instance, 25% less damage, but a 30% chance to deal double damage, 15% chance to deal triple damage. If you have no other sources of more damage like this, then that's going to be 20% more damage. But if you do have other sources of double damage, it's going to be less than 20% more damage. If you've got a lot of sources of double damage, as a lot of endgame builds tend to have, or especially if you've got a lot of sources of triple damage, then this is going to be worse. But interestingly, this is a chance for the Duelist to play very, very, very well in conjunction with ailments, which is something that hasn't really been talked about yet. Then we have your critical strike chance is lucky, but your damage with hits is unlucky. This really, really punishes certain setups. You would never use this with Ephemeral Edge, you would never use this with Volatility Support, you'd never use this with Rezlatha's Coil, but in conjunction with a whole bunch of other things, it's really, really interesting. So lots of cool stuff going on the top left wing. We have a look at risk aversion at the north end. We have 50% chance to avoid ailments, 50% chance to avoid stun. You want to get these stats up to 100%, and then this becomes a really good node. It's one of those things that's going to feel pretty good if you can get that 50% elsewhere. I'm just trying to think where you would get it as a Duelist. 50% to avoid stun. Maybe someone in chat can think of that. People are asking in chat, growing accumulator, how does this work with ailments? So I'm talking non-damaging ailments. So if you have 30% chance to deal double damage and you are applying an ignite, then this is not going to cause the ignite to burn twice as bright. However, it is going to cause the shock to apply as though you dealt double damage. So that's the sort of, that is a good clarification. Thanks to Yuzuyoya for raising that, because I had misspoken on that. It is not damaging ailments that it's useful for. It is entirely non-damaging ailments. So shock in particular, but also you're in the Duelist section of the tree. Leadership's price is an option, although Leadership's price has sort of fallen behind some of the power creep in the amulet slot in recent times. Just for people who aren't familiar with this item, because it's really cool, but everyone's forgotten it existed because it tends not to be at the very, very top of end of building anymore. So Leadership's price has 3 mods that are RNG. A perfect one is 1 in 343 to roll. You probably won't get one of those. I mean, I guess you also have the Onyx Amulet roll as well, because you can't change that on a corrupted item. But the main ones are these maximum resistances. The key thing though, you cannot ignite, chill, freeze, or shock, but your hits always scorch, always apply brittle, and always apply sap, and they do so based upon the entire damage that you dealt. So your chaos damage can and does sap, shock, and sap, brittle, and scorch. All of those happen all the time. So that's something that's cool. People pointing out, yeah, the Utmost is higher power. I don't even think the Utmost is the best item in that slot. The Amulet slot, particularly in Settlers League, there are some really broken things that go on between the interaction of Hinakora's locks, the Calandra, what's it called? The Calandra thing that flips the Krangle Mirror thing. There's something that was introduced. It was called the Ethereal Reflecting Mist. I think it might just be called the Reflecting Mist now. And it and a well-rolled Simplex or Focused Amulet ends up being better than everything there. So, like, essentially, the Amulet slot at the very top end is pretty much always going to be a Calandra Reflected Heist Amulet, or it's going to be a really ridiculously rolled Utmost. But then there's sort of a second tier below that where you've got the still very good amulet that comes from the Eater of Worlds. What's it called? Crystallized Omniscience. Crystallized Omniscience is one. You've also got Ashes of the Stars is viable on certain builds. It's not universal. It's universally good, but it's not universally great. But on builds that scale a lot with quality, Ashes of the Stars is good. You've got a Heist Amulet that hasn't been Calandra Reflected. You've got a really well-rolled normal rare. You've got a normal rare that's been Calandra Reflected and has come out well. There's a whole lot of different options in that amulet slot. But at the top end, the Hinakora's Lock, Simplex Amulet, or Focused Amulet, and Reflecting Mist combination is just so ridiculously good that stuff like Leadership's price, it gets forgotten because when the top 0.1% of players don't consider it usable, there tends to be this effect where that flows down to other players even when it might be useful for them. All of that said, that's Leadership's price. That's an item that would work pretty well in conjunction with Growing Accumulator, because then you can just every now and again you can get a big scorch on the enemy. Every now and again you can get a big sap. Every now and again you can get a big brittle, and that can work well. A Spectacular Parlay. This is going to be really hard to build for because you would need a weapon that, well, if you're using weapons, you need a weapon that has a high degree of consistency in its damage. You do not want to have a wide range. Essentially, the way that lucky and unlucky work on damage. If your damage is lucky, then you on average deal 2/3 of the top end plus 1/3 of the bottom end. If your damage is unlucky, on average you deal 2/3 of the bottom end plus 1/3 of the top end. And if your damage is neither lucky nor unlucky, then you deal 50% of each on average. So, and if you want to verify that, because I'm just asserting that, but if you want to verify that, you can do it just by integrating. So put out that old year 12 calculus, you can get some use out of that. Just integrate the area under the curve of y equals x squared or y equals square root of x, and that will give you that information there. So whole bunch of silly things. And yeah, of course, Yoke Sufferings come up in chat as well as an amulet. I'd forgotten as well. But basically, Spectacular Parlay, if you can get to the point that there is less variance between your minimum and maximum damage, then this could be good. I'm trying to think of skills that have that. I think it's Sacrifice Support might work with this. Let me just... Sacrifice Support. Let's bring this one up. It's... Supported skills sacrifice 20% of your current life when cast to gain added chaos damage equal to 25 to 44% of the amount of life that you sacrifice. So this is not trivial to fund, and it can't work on a bunch of different skills. But this is something to at least give some thought to here. Now, this cannot be used by skills used by traps or mines. So one of my first thoughts isn't going to work with that. But basically, this is one of those things, and it is only spell skills as well. So there's a lot of limitations on this, but it is something that adds flat spell damage, to both the minimum and the maximum. You want to avoid lightning damage with this. I think it's cold damage that has less variance than fire as well. And so there's a bunch of things you could consider that it's all a little bit dubious as to whether or not this is going to work on your build. Critical strike chance is lucky, has more effect the closer that your critical strike chance is to 50% without it. So if you can get your critical strike chance way past 50% without this, then it's not going to work for you. And yeah, low life support for attacks is another one. That's called, I'm trying to think. Thank you for reminding me of that, Pathmaker. It's not Bloodlust support, is it? It's it was added in 3.14. So let's just go to Ultimatum League. Ultimatum League, that'll find us 3.14. That'll find us the support gem in question. So 3.14.0 and major new content and features. It will be in here. It is Bloodthirst support. There we go. So supported attacks deal added physical damage with weapons equal to 2% of your maximum life, but this is conditional upon you being on low life. So if you have 8,000 life, then it's going to give you 160 flat physical to both the minimum and the maximum. So that's something that you could conceivably use. And whilst that doesn't sound like a lot at first, keep in mind that that is flat damage. You'd want to use this in conjunction with effects that provide multiplication of damage. The problem is actually that most of the things that would synergize with that actually don't synergize with growing accumulator. So one of my first thoughts that does not work at all was Paradoxica. Paradoxica is normally really good in conjunction with the Bloodlust support. Bloodthirst support. Paradoxica would be normally really good, but Paradoxica has a 100% chance to deal double damage already. Going from 100 to 130 achieves nothing, but you have this 25% less damage, so this node actually becomes a net negative then. So there's going to be a whole bunch of thinking there in order to make that, in order to find something where Spectacular Parlay is an upside, but Growing Accumulator is not that big a downside. One last thing I'll say with Spectacular Parlay before we move on. This is something that has a very significant tapering off. You are going to hit a point where you can crit cap without this, and once you hit that point, you absolutely do not want this node. So you want to have a fallback plan, something you're going to pick up once you no longer need this. And then if we have a look around here, we've got the Overly Confident Wing, which we'll have a look at next. So damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky while you are on low life. This is phenomenal, and it also does work in conjunction with what we were talking about with Bloodthirst support. So there is definitely something you could go with here, where you could have Overly Confident set up alongside Spectacular Parlay and try and make something work there with Bloodthirst. And damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky. Varies in power. Against monsters, most monsters scale their damage from 80% to 120% of base damage. So in that situation, damage being unlucky is actually only about, it's only about 6 2/3% less damage taken. There are some that scale more than that, but actually come to think of it, this is maybe not so hot. And it's like having 1/14 more life, which is not great. You'd take it, but I don't know that I want it as a 2-point Ascendancy node. Then we have the next thing where you can choose to focus on spell block or attack block. So there's the Gladiator has a 4-point node that causes you to have chance to block be lucky for both attacks and spells, but that one's conditional upon you having blocked recently. This is unconditional on that. I feel like Heads and Tails are going to be at their absolute best if you are making a character that fights one boss only. So let's say that you build a character and your primary purpose with this character is to fight um, Uber Shaper. Uber Shaper, almost all of the damage in that fight is from spells, so having spell block be lucky is a big deal. That feels like it's something that could be useful, but this is not generically useful. The other thing you could use is, I think it's called Sapphire's Frame. Sapphire's Frame has a big drawback normally. So this is the shield that has the text 4% to all maximum resistances, but you cannot block attack damage. It's got a big chunk of spell block on it, and so Sapphire's Frame plus Tempest Shield plus something else can pretty easily get you to be spell block capped. And then in conjunction with that, you don't really get any additional drawback. So you suffer the drawback of Sapphire's Frame, but then the additional drawback that is present on heads does not apply to you because you're already unable to block attacks, so it doesn't matter that your chance to block them is unlucky. That's a potential thing you could do there, but it's reasonably nasty there. Someone in chat has asked, what's the interaction between Spectacular Parlay and effects that make your lightning damage, for instance, be lucky? And here, if you are both unlucky and lucky at the same time, you end up being neither. So you go back to neutral. Given how good lightning damage is when it's lucky, so if lightning damage tends to be 1 to 200 or ranges like that, because of that, I would say that you don't want to take damage with hits is unlucky, especially given that the primary builds that are dealing lightning damage at the moment in PathOfExile 1, 3.25, the primary builds that are doing that are actually ones that play Resolute Technique anyway, so they're not able to crit. It's not that you have to be unable to crit, it's not that you can't invest in crit on those builds, it's just that players have messed around with them a bit and have discovered that the best way to do it is not to. And someone's pointing out Winds of Fate, which is an item I'd forgotten. This drops from the Sanctum content. So I'm going to bring this one up because it's a very interesting item. Winds of Fate is very tricky. There are a few ways to circumvent this. This is one of the most overwhelmingly damaging weapons in the game. So it has 700 to 800% IPD. It has 100% global critical strike multiplier. 75% of fizz damage is converted to a random element and 25% converted to chaos. So that is basically the game saying, hey, guess what? We're going to mess up most of the ways that players would scale damage by default. Then, however, it has the very nasty text, maximum critical strike chance is 50%, non-crits deal no damage. So this is a very difficult item to use, but it has a fairly narrow range of damage. Not narrow, but somewhat narrow. I think it's 80% to 120% or something along those lines. So damage being unlucky is not crushing with it. It's a nuisance, but it's not crushing. In fact, it's probably more like 70 to 130%. Just looking at that. Yeah, so it's 70 to 130%. So that means it's 10% less damage to be unlucky on it with your attack damage, which is bad, but manageable. In exchange for that, your critical strike chance is lucky, so you're getting 75% chance to deal damage at all. You've got to get your critical strike chance up only to 50%, which is not that much of an investment. I like this idea. I really, really like this setup. So thanks, Tumblr, for pointing that one out. Winds of Fate in conjunction with Spectacular Parlay, strong combination. This looks like it's going to be something that people will want to build around. Very important warning if you're thinking of doing this. Winds of Fate is cheap in trade leagues normally. That is not because it's common. This item is rare. This comes from one of the hard mode ways you can do the Sanctum that is tied to getting one of the particular unique relics, the Second Sacrament. So the Second Sacrament makes Lycia much stronger than she would normally be, but in exchange for that, if you do it on a level 83 Forbidden Tome, then you end up getting the, in addition to the normal loot from Lycia, you also get Winds of Fate drop. However, warning, warning, warning. The Second Sacrament is the second rarest of all of those unique relics. The only one that's rarer is the one that gives you Original Sin. So, do not count on getting this early. This is going to be potentially harder to get than the Sandstorm Visage hat is in a normal trade league, because the Sandstorm Visage relic is a lot more common than the Second Sacrament. That said, The second sacrament one is easier to defeat. So that will help. That will help a little bit. But it's still the case that most people who are running these special relics, most people are not failing Sanctum ever with it. So all that said, Winds of Fate will be expensive this league. If anyone really wants to try and make this work, there is a strong type of synergy between the Gambler and Winds of Fate. But at the same time, you've got to deal with the fact that 25% of the time, you're not hitting at all. The other thing people use this with as well, just so people know, there is a helmet. I think it's called Plume of Pursuit. I believe it's called Plume of Pursuit. That's really interesting with Winds of Fate. So Winds of Fate is something that theoretically would deal absolutely staggering damage with Battle Mage. Battle Mage adds the damage of your weapon onto any spells that you use. Plume of Pursuit means that your spell skills always crit when on their final repeat, and this overrules the wording that's on the Winds of Fate item that limits your crits to 50%. That limit on Winds of Fate applies to spells as well. So Plume of Pursuit allows you to overrule that and get a guaranteed crit on final repeats. And there's a number of shenanigans you can do with Spell Echo there that can do some cool stuff. There was a build that was using this combination that did some crazy damage, but it was also clunky and different. It was an interesting setup. And I'm just thinking with Plume of Pursuit, you can't get Battle Mage doing this except via Cadigan's Crown, and Cadigan's Crown doesn't work. So this is not a setup that I would recommend, but at the very least, there's something to think about there. I would say that this is not a solved problem, but there are some thoughts. It's interesting people saying in chat, yeah, that they've had the Winds of Fate, that people have been running Sanctum hundreds of times, like literally 200 times, and has only got one of the Winds of Fate relic. I feel like that was unlucky. I think it's like, I think the rarities are something like, I think it's like a drop weight of 1 for the one that gives you OSIN, 10 for the one that gives you Winds of Fate, and then most of the others are 20, 30, or 40 or something like that. I feel that's the way that it works, but it's not actually known. Someone else is pointing out there is a timeless jewel that makes you blind, prevents you from having the that prevents you from using a helmet, and that gives you lucky crit as well. So there's a few things there that can do shenanigans, but all this sort of stuff is intriguing. Now we have the really fun stuff. Risky Exploit, minus 25 to all elemental resistances. You are going to have to make this up, but this is only minus 25%, and it's not to maximum resistances. So this is easily managed. If you're at endgame, you can definitely overcap. Like this is essentially it's a little bit worse than players suffer from elemental weakness, but it's pretty easy to overcap. And the 50% chance for elemental resistances to count as being 90% against enemy hits is a pretty strong defensive layer, but it only applies to hits and it doesn't apply to damage over time. I feel like the more damaging thing is probably actually elemental damage over time. So there is defensive power here, but it's not for every fight. For instance, I feel like this could be... Where would this be really bad? Like this is useless in the Cortex. In Cortex and Uber Cortex, this is going to be doing very little there. And then there's a whole bunch of other, like, I wouldn't want it in Uber Cortex, but at the same time, it's going to be really good when you're mapping. There's always that thing though, that 50% chance, you can easily lose a coin flip 5 times in a row. And so you can get into a lot of trouble with that. All in all, I think Risky Exploit is at the weaker end of 2-pointers. It is an upside. It may not be an upside when you first are eligible to take it, but it will become one. I just don't think this is great. I would say that you want to use this alongside Purity of Elements early on, and then at some later point, maybe you don't want to have this anymore. However, Reversed Odds is really good. 50% chance to treat your hits as inverting the enemy's elemental resistances. This is mathematically equivalent to the enemy's resistances all being 0, which is the powerful thing that Original Sin does. Okay, granted, Original Sin has a bunch of other shenanigans going on as well, but Reversed Odds is something that is really good in conjunction with tri-element attacks in particular. So if you're playing a build that is doing elemental hit of the spectrum, classic elemental hit even, any of these things that do multiple different types of elements of damage, reversed odds can be really good at just solving all your penetration at once. So this is strong, but then at the same time, it's also got some of the limitations that the Inquisitor node does that gives you this effect on crits. The Inquisitor version of this is worth the 4 points, but it's also something that can limit your ability to scale into the stratosphere on builds. Where this really shines, though, where reversed odds is absolutely phenomenal, is in conjunction with running maps that are Eater of Worlds or Searing Exarch aligned, and then you can get monsters that you can buff their resistances to the stratosphere, and you just don't care, because you've got reversed odds or because you've got the Inquisitor node that does the same thing. So, that is, however, unfortunately behind Risky Exploit, and Risky Exploit is, whilst it's good, it's not a strict upgrade. So it causes a new problem your build has to solve, that 25% to all elemental resistances. And all in all, that's the Gambler Ascendancy. Where do I think people will go with this? Firstly, there's that Sapphire's Frame package. Sapphire's Frame in conjunction with Heads. That forces you to take Overly Confident, but Overly Confident is something that you can make work. Sapphire's Frame can definitely be used in conjunction with a bunch of things, but you could even use it with... Petrified Blood, and then damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky. There's a lot of defensive power there. You are going to be very squishy against enemy attack damage then, though, because you've got no block chance for attacks, and that's going to be something you'll have to have some solution to. I'm not going to claim to have solved that yet, but that's my thoughts there. Spectacular Parlay, I think the best use case for this is probably going to be that Winds of Fate, that Sanctum Staff. But remember, that thing is rare. There's a lot of ways to use that, and I feel maybe people will start attacking with it, but it's a weird item. It's a cool item. It's a weird one. And then you're starting to look at dealing 3 different elements of damage and chaos damage all at the same time. You got to find a way to scale that. Original Sin would work, but Original Sin is expensive. For some funny reason, it's kind of good. And there's not much else. You could conceivably try and convert... Could you convert through other elements really effectively? I don't think so. Risk Aversion is just generic good stuff, and you should take it once you can get more of these stats elsewhere. And then, yeah, there's some power in here. Reversed odds, though, is where it's all about. And then after this, there's a question, which Ascendancy should we showcase next? Vote in the news post to let us know. The other 3 Ascendancies are the Daughter of Ashabi, the Servant of Arakali, and the Disciple of the Trial Master. At the time that I looked at this, the Disciple of the Trial Master was winning, despite me voting for Servant of Arakali. I seem to have been in the smallest minority there. Let's see if that's still the case. Is the Disciple of the Trial Master? It is still an absolute majority. However, my Servant of Arakali brethren have taken 2nd place, but it looks like the God of Chaos is going to be the next one that they showcase. I will definitely do a video on that when it comes out, which is going to be a bit of fun. Interesting question that's come up in chat, something I was thinking about. What will happen with Forbidden Jewels in this league? Tumblr Yumbler's asking that. My intuition is that they're going to give PoE 1 normal things. So, for instance, you could get Profane Bloom. Even though you can't be an occultist in this, you can be a Harbinger who is a witch, and then you could potentially spec Propane Boom. That said, I could be wrong. They could have decided to go the other way there. When do I think this event will come out is being asked in chat. I have no idea. My intuition is as follows. They originally had a planned timeline for when PoE 2 would come out, and they have decided internally, we're going to let that slip 1 week in order to do a PoE 1 event that's going to run for 4 weeks. I feel like if they're going to do that, they probably want to have the PoE 1 event out maybe towards the end of February. And then that means PoE 2 0.2.0 can come out late in March. And then they'll run that for a substantial period of time before 3.26 comes out. Konaclap is asking what the details is with all the Harbinger skills. I went through that earlier in this. So if you want to rewind this, you can also rewind. One of the things I like on YouTube streams, you can then rewind it and then put it at 150 or 175% normal speed, and you might catch up, you might not. I don't think this is coming out in the next 2 weeks, like Cookie Man is asking, but I could be wrong. I know grinding gear games move fast, especially when they don't need to balance things super tightly. However, there is one more thing that's very important that needs to be shown as well. This, I think, might be a permanent change to the game. At least that's my intuition. I could be wrong. This is a new map device. Notice how there is this new thing off to the left here that allows you to store 34 extra items. Now, there's a few things that could conceivably be going on here. This could be something that stores a whole bunch of pre-rolled maps for you and can also store a stack of scarabs, stack of other things along those lines. Or it could be something for relics or league stones or something else that hasn't yet been revealed. So, one option that I have seen discussed by people, this was not my thought, but some people have thought maybe it'll be something akin to those relics we were talking about when we were discussing the Sanctum stuff. So, Winds of Fate has the Second Sacrament tied to it. It's a 1x4 relic, candlestick relic, that then allows you to modify a Sanctum in some way. Because there is something a bit similar, like this seems like it's not fully unveiled here, there is a bit of a similarity to the Sanctum. Maybe it is something that is for this Freesia event only, and that is a spot where you can put relics in to modify your mapping. Alternately, it might not be that, and it might be somewhere that you can store maps and scarabs just for faster access. If it is somewhere that you can store maps and scarabs, then it's going to be phenomenal, just for making mapping feel smoother. And that's going to be something I think players will love and will definitely clamour to have in the base game. And I also think it's something that would be amazing to have in PathOfExile 2 as well. Even without scarabs yet, just the ability to go, okay, I'm going to batch 20 maps, I'm going to put them all into this spot, and then I'm just going to start running them. And I'm also going to put the ones that are less important to me, that I can run on towers, I can run on things without any in-map events, that can go up the top. And then my 16s can go down the bottom, whatever it is. Also, I just noticed this is this is 40 here, not 34. I thought it was 6x6 with 2 holes, but it's 6x7 with 2 holes. 40 would actually make a little bit more sense as somewhere to store maps. I feel like it's it's a bit on the larger end. And Rave Shaw's just pointed that out in chat. They've said that during the time delay between me saying it and you hearing it, which is kind of funny. So that's going to be something that'll be really interesting to see exactly what they decide to do with this. I think this is going to be a player favorite if they nail it. If they nail this, it'll be great. If they don't nail it, well, yeah, that's sort of always the case with things. On top of that, everything else looks pretty similar. That's a lot of Kirak missions, but that would be the case if someone's run, 1,000 maps on an Atlas and they've forgotten to unspec Commissioned Officer, or if they're running that node that gives you the Doriani's Machinarium. What's the name of the Planar Tactician? I think is the name of the node. It grants you comprehensive scouting reports. That's the ones. So yeah, I think that's basically what we've got so far when it comes to this. I'm just going to check if anything has been changed where it's been refreshed. So I'll just do a quick refresh in the background and see if anything much has changed. Doubt it will have, but it's best to just have a quick look. And how much commentary is there on here? Only 11 pages. That's and I accidentally doubled up mine, so I assume that happened a bunch. There was a lot of tech issues with the forums when I was starting that. I think at this point, that is basically what we know. So let's just do a quick recap of everything that we've got here. The Harbinger, these nodes that give a summon Greater Harbinger of the Arcane skill, that is tied to the unique item Torrent's Reclamation. Greater Harbinger of Time was the one that was tied to the Immortal Will, I think. No, that was the Searching Thoughts. Hang on. Sorry, no, Time is the one. Greater Harbinger of Time is the one that's tied to Torrent's Reclamation. Harbinger of the Arcane is the one that's tied to Surging Thoughts. and the other one is tied to the Immortal Will. All stats of those are known, except the information on the one from Surging Thoughts is pretty incomplete. So if someone has this item in-game at the moment in Path of Exile 1, maybe it's worth just having a quick look at everything else you can figure out about it, because that might be useful. All in all, though, I think this is one of the weaker Ascendancies I've seen. The increased area of effect of Hex skills and Temp Chains has no reservation if cast as an aura is inherently very strong, but doesn't fit in thematically that much with the rest of the Ascendancy. It does fit in thematically with the idea of a Harbinger, just Temp Chains. This is a strong node, but the rest of it is just not quite there. It's going to be hard to get an 8 coherent points in this. You're going to want to take this because of its own power. You probably take CDR and Greater Harbinger of Time skill. And then after that, I think you're just forced to take either buffs expire 30% slower, debuffs 30% faster, or 30% mana recovery, 30% energy shield recovery rate. And this 30-30 node here, both these 30-30 nodes here, they feel like 60% of the power I would expect from a Path of Exile 1 Ascendancy node. So your 4th lab is going to feel bad. That's my thoughts on this Ascendancy here. That said, I'm sure someone will come up with something spicy you can do with it. There'll be some weird stuff with it. And the Hexblast synergies have come up in chat there from Zach. I think the key thing with your Hexblast stuff is that when you've got a hex that is cast as an aura, if an enemy is inside that and you Hexblast them, you get the benefits of the greater Hexblast as though they were hexed. However, that enemy then loses the blasphemy aura on them until they exit and re-enter it. So if you've got range control on the enemy, then yes, you can get them back into it, but it's kind of clunky. It would work better if you wanted to use this in conjunction with Hexblast. I would actually say, let's go old school. Forget about the mines and go with Ignite. Hexblast Ignite. Hexblast has weird text that allows the damage, chaos damage it deals to Ignite. So let's just bring this up so people can see it. Hexblast. Hexblast has this text that says, all damage can ignite, freeze, and shock. So you don't need to be dealing fire damage in order to inflict Ignite. You can do it with chaos damage. You can even do it if you're adding physical damage to the spell somehow, like with an Elder-influenced helmet. You can do that. And if the enemy is hexed, 40% more damage with elements is good. Hexblast hits really hard. The problem is that if you don't kill with the first one, you've then got to go outside and come back in. That's kind of clunky. Hexblast is also a very slow cast if you do it manually. So that's the option that you've got there. Hexblast Contradiction also exists. This is something that is sort of very specific to certain builds. It's got more critical strike chance. That's 4%, goes up to 6%. And it's got this chaos damage with hits is resisted by highest elemental resistance instead of lowest elemental resistance, which is generally bad. But in conjunction with the Inquisitor, this tends to be quite good. But again, that's the Inquisitor, not the setup that we've got here. So Hexblast Contradiction is a brick. And Hexblast of Havoc is just a weird skill. It does something else. It just hits the enemy once. It's faster. And the only impact of it being hex, it doesn't remove the hex. It then causes it to explode to other enemies. Maybe Hexblast of Havoc could be used, actually. How much damage is that? That's 1366 to 2044 is pretty high. It's actually a little bit lower than Hexblast Classic, but it's faster. So maybe Hexblast of Havoc could be used to ignite just because it's quicker, but it's still, it's not that much. Oh, hang on, no, it doesn't give you the ignite ability, does it? So forget that. Forget I was talking about that. You have to use that with hits. Or you'd need, you could poison with it. You could use Zerfi's Heart to make it ignite. I don't really think it's, I don't really think that this is going anywhere other than casting Hexblast as an ignite skill. So, or is it 250 milliseconds? That Inkbot's clarifying that I may just be wrong on that. Hexblast and Blasphemy causes the curse to reapply 250 milliseconds later, is what's being said there. I'm just going to verify that. Not that I don't believe you, but it disagrees with what I've been told in the past. So I want to check that, because if I was wrong, let's get that corrected. And Is there anything on the wiki about it? That's one that's one I'll have to test in game. But in any case, Hexblast mines. This doesn't benefit Hexblast mines very much. That's, I guess, the key thing to say here. It's on the Hexblast page, is it? Okay, cool. Let's bring that up. Traditional Hexblast and skill function, and if it is because it not to. Okay, so Cursed Ground is, for example, it can be applied by any means. It removes the curse with the lowest remaining duration. It's affected by Cursed Ground. It needs to exit, then re-enter. Blasphemy will reapply after 250 milliseconds. Excellent. Thank you for that clarification, Inkbot. It is different to Cursed Ground support. So that's the... yeah, that means that you could use this with Self-Cast Hexblast Hit if you wanted to. That's interesting in that if you were to get your cast speed up to a level that it's sub 250 milliseconds, which would be 300% increased cast speed, or some more cast speed in conjunction with that, that would actually brick it. That's kind of funny. So that means that as Custom Critical Strike, is it... I think it could work with Custom Critical Strike, potentially. Oh no, Hexblast has that text preventing that, doesn't it? Hexblast has skills cast time added to its cooldown if triggered. Okay, so that means you could still trigger it. If you got 40% CDR, then you're looking at 700 milliseconds. It's going to be ready again. So that's 700 milliseconds is a long time without your big payload going off in PathOfExile 1. It feels like it's a marginal option, but yeah, there's something going on there. There's a bunch of cool stuff you can try here. So yeah, weird shenanigans that you can pull on that. And ultimately, though, the whole thing here, like this is the single most powerful node here on this. Greater Harbinger of Time is next most powerful. CDR is good, but it does feel like a 60% power tax node, maybe a 70% power node or 80%. This feels like a 60% power node. This feels like a 60% power node. Immune to curses, chill and shock while channeling it, or unaffected, is pretty limited niche. Like if you can channel all the time, which some builds can do, if you're playing Cyclone, then that's reasonably strong. Maybe there's something in here for Cyclone as well. This, all in all, I think there's a bunch of cool stuff to explore with the Harbinger, but I do feel like this is at the lower end of power level for PoE 1. So imagine the Assassin didn't exist in PoE 1. The Assassin comes out. It's a little bit weaker than everything else. It does have some cool things it can do. I think this is like that, or the Saboteur for that matter. There's a few things it's going to be best at, and that's a fine niche to have. And especially because it's going to be for a limited time, unless they decide to make these things go core as new options, which they might. It's got some cool stuff there. Gambler, just going back to the quick summary here. Spectacular Parlay is extremely limited. The only use case I can think of with this is Winds of Fate, where is the only place I think it's going to be really solid. And damage with hits is unlucky is a huge drawback. Bloodthirst support maybe, and sacrifice support maybe as well. So those are things that grant a lot of both minimum and maximum damage to attacks and spells respectively. But critical strike chance being lucky is really good, but it is definitely at its best in conjunction with Winds of Fate, that unique staff. Growing Accumulator is good at times, but unfortunately the thing it's worst with is Paradoxica, and Paradoxica is really good with Spectacular Parlay. Well, at least Paradoxica in conjunction with Bloodthirst support would be really good with that, because Bloodthirst is better with Paradoxica than pretty much anything else. Growing Accumulator also kind of bricks a few other things like Annihilating Light in particular. So there's a bunch of weird stuff going on here, but overall there's some potential. There's some potential to build around here, but the power's a bit lower than we're used to. Risk Aversion, generic good stuff, and I think people are pointing out Crystal Skin. completes it, and you can either allocate that directly or anoint it. Risky Exploit is interesting. It is a lower powered node than a lot of others, but it is also leading to the best thing about the Gambler Ascendancy, which is reversed odds. Reversed odds is just phenomenal. 50% chance to treat enemy monster elemental resistance values as inverted. This is phenomenal. It's basically the Inquisitor node, that 4-pointer Inquisitor node that only applies to crits there, but it applies to everything. And then you've got Overly Confident is very niche, but does have those Sapphire's framed shenanigans with heads. So there is something you can do with there. If you only want 4 points out of here, you could possibly go reversed odds and Sapphire's frame set up with heads. But then you've got to have something to mitigate attack damage, which is going to be substantially painful. Probably have to do that with evasion, I'd say, and maybe that could work. So you got a whole bunch of evasion on your gear, except for Sapphire's frame. Then you've got to set up there. I feel like there's something there. Kilowava's Bluster is being asked about with Risky Exploit. Let me just bring that one up because I cannot remember it. Kilowava's Bluster. There are so many unique items in here that you just can't remember them all. Okay, so this is 30 to 40% chance for elemental resistances to count as being 90% against enemy hits. My interpretation of the interaction of these two is that it will add up to 90% chance. It'll add up to 90% if you have both of these, if you got a perfect roll on it. This is something where if you had PathOfExile 2's Krangle Divining, and you could get Kilowava's Bluster up to 49% chance, that would be really good. You then get 99% chance to treat your elemental resistances as 90. In that case, I don't think you would want to run around with negative 60 resistances, but you could go close to it. You'd just be in that spot where you're 1% maybe to fall over. But when it's 90% chance to treat them as 90%, I don't think you want to go any lower than 60% on your LA resistances. And so you still have to invest in elemental resistances. That's the problem there. And so I'm just having a quick look at everything else there. So someone is thinking, so Eagle's asking in chat, are these going to potentially work like Affliction Ascendancies? My interpretation is they're definitely not. They're talking about in the announcement that these are alternatives to your Ascendancies. So if the 19 Ascendancy classes you know and are familiar with are all of a sudden replaced by a different 19, not supplemented by an additional 19, but replaced. So this means that, my interpretation at least, if you play as a witch, you are banned from taking Occultist. You are able to take Harbinger instead. There'll be 2 other choices as well, but you are banned from playing as an Occultist. That's my understanding. I wouldn't be surprised if Forbidden Jewels work like they normally do. Replica Lawweave has been mentioned here as something. That's the one that provides a whole bunch of stats, but also has a drawback of setting your maximum resistances to 70, 71, or 72, depending on the explicit roll on it. That would definitely work well in conjunction with this Gambler node. Once we find it again, the Gambler node of Risky Exploit, if you were to also take Kilowava's Bluster. I feel like you want Kilowava's Bluster then, so you can get 90% chance to have your resistances count as being 90% against enemy hits, and the actual max resistance is 70 or 71 or 72, that would work. Replica Lawweave is inherently quite strong. So this is another example of a dumpster tier unique that's being pushed up to being at least intriguing, if not good, because of this new Ascendancy. How good is Kilowava's Bluster in general? It's a chance to avoid elemental ailments, chance to block. It's got its unique mod. Otherwise, it's a fair chunk of evasion. There's a bit of a package there. I don't think it's extraordinary. I think it's still pretty ordinary. I feel like for Kilowava's Bluster, Replica Lawweave, and the Gambler Ascendancy to work well, I would want Kilowava's Bluster to be to have plus 200 life, or to have some other powerful offensive stat on it. If it had that, then I'd potentially consider this a good setup, but I'm not sold on that, but I think it's worth playing around with. And Kilowava's Bluster from memory is quite common as well. Growing Accumulator and Spectacular Parley and Critical Strike Ignite has come up in chat. I think the problem you're going to face here is that Growing Accumulator, the triple damage or double damage procs that you get from Growing Accumulator are not going to scale Ignite. They will scale shocks, they will scale freezes that are inflicted by that damage, but they're not going to scale the Ignite. And so it's just going to end up at 25% less damage. I think we'll be crushing on that. Anyways, I think that's basically covered everything significant that's going on with the Legacy of Frisia event from what we know so far. My plans from here, I probably should state this while we're finishing off the stream. My plans from here are that I'll go back to doing videos rather than streams about the new reveals. I felt like this was one though that was just a little bit different. It's sort of something that came out of the blue, and it happened to be right at the perfect time for me to drop a stream instead. Otherwise though, I think we've pretty much covered what's known so far. Unless there's anything more, let's check the PathOfExile.com homepage. Might actually be able to finally go and play some of Pox's event a bit more. I'm miles behind the curve in that because I've been so disrupted between IRL commitments, my Sunday, my Monday, and then just having this to do a stream on today, and yesterday having the announcements around the patch, all that sort of stuff. I'm only at level 81 in that, and I'm only just starting to break out of white tier maps. I haven't even done Lab 4 yet. So lots more to go in Pox's event. That is still going, and I think Groningen Games added another 5,000 spots. So I think they're now up to 35,000 spots in that. So it'll be the biggest private league ever by a factor of like probably 2. And it sort of almost feels like a small trade league. Probably almost as big actually as the Necro Settlers start was. And of course, if you prefer not to do a fresh start, Necro Settlers is still going. Settlers proper is still going. Standard, of course, is still there for that section of the player base for whom Standard's the right place to play, which I think the PathOfExile subreddit is very dismissive of, but it is the right place for some people, and they should play it if they're going to have more fun there. If you're the sort of person that doesn't get to play the game more than about 40 hours in a league cycle, then Standard's going to be the most fun for you. And of course, PathOfExile 2 is still around. Bandit's confirming that it's now 40,000 in Pox League, which is just amazing. That's it's pushing the size of the gauntlets. The biggest player-run events that have ever happened have been gauntlets, all of them, and they've had like 54,000 players. But I think with the gauntlets, a lot of people, their approach is, I'm just going to play it for 2 hours. I'm going to play until my first character dies, or my second character dies, or maybe the first time I get out of Act 1. Then once that character dies, I'm finished with it. There's a lot of people that play it that way. There's no right or wrong way to play it, but it is something that people go into because it's different, whereas Pox's event is just, let's go back to POE 1 for a little while and do something else. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results. Thank you all, and I will see you folks around.